My name is Ruth Gonzalez, and Joy Lou is in this meeting with me as well. We both have our antenna on. So we just want to welcome you to our Zoom workshop about certifying your pollinator garden. We have only hosted a couple of Zoom workshops, so we're hoping everything goes great. But let's keep our fingers crossed and y'all be a little patient, all right? We are going to have a pretty good crowd of people, so we're going to keep everyone muted until the end. And at that point, we're going to ask y'all if you have questions along the way or at the end to write your questions in chat. And chat is a little icon at the bottom of your screen, okay? And that way we'll be able to get to all your questions. So we have a pollinator garden here at Reems Creek Nursery, and it really gives us a little thrill. This is our third year that this garden has been planted, and even in the second year, even the first year, it came in so beautifully. It was so inspiring. And we just recently went through this same certification and have now posted our sign on our garden. So the certification is with Bee City USA Asheville, and they are a part of Asheville Greenworks. And if y'all know, Bee City USA actually started here. Asheville was the very first Bee City USA, and now they are all over the country and even in Canada. And there's also Bee City campus, so it's been highly successful. But luckily, Phyllis Stiles, the founder, lives here, and so we get extra benefits. So she is one of the people on the steering committee of the Pollinator Bee City USA Asheville. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to let y'all know, the main foundation of these gardens is native plants, and we are having a perennial sale right now. When I say native plants, a lot of it is native perennials. So we are having 10% off all of our perennials except the vines and shrubs. So it's a great opportunity to beef up your pollinator garden before you get it certified. I think what we'll do now then is switch into, if I can do this, screen sharing. So bear with me just a second while I find that icon and at the same time find my my PowerPoint. Okay, so, oh dear. Okay, sorry, I'm having a little issue. Hi, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. Sorry, people. Let's see. Hi. Oh, I can suddenly see everyone's faces. That's awesome. Okay, so we're going to start screen sharing. And I still can't find that icon. Something's covering it. Sorry. Let's see. They got emailed it. Joy?
Oh, yes, hello?
How about saying something about the pollinator garden for a minute while I'm figuring this out?
Oh, sure. So right now we've had some of the Red Rocks penstemon that's blooming, and it has been covered in bees. It's pretty funny to watch them like go into like each flower, and they've got like their butts hanging out. And also our Nepeta, the catmint has just been blooming up a storm. It's just been covered in pollinators. So it's been a lot of fun having our pollinator garden here, because it's not too much work once you put in the installation of the garden itself. But man, the bees have really shown up to celebrate this garden with us. So it's been a lot of fun. We also we did sort of like a nice spring revamp where we mulched it and we gave it like some fresh flowers, like we put in some gaillardia. Um, that one's really blooming very nicely right now. It's just starting to get started. We did put in some Tithonia. That's one of our big favorites. We sell that in our annual department. It's also known as Mexican sunflower. It's got these big bright orange flowers, and that's a wonderful pollinator plant. Oh, I need to do it.
Okay, so we've got the screen up and we're starting this screen share. So basically, we're going to talk about certifying your pollinator garden. And when we're talking about that, and you can see the cute little sign right here that you will get if you choose to once your garden is certified. And I have to say, I was around in my neighborhood and just discovered one at one of my neighbors' gardens, and I was so thrilled. So the thing that we want to know about this garden is it is based on native plants. Okay, so you want to know that. So why would we want to plant a pollinator garden to begin with? Well, we do need pollinators. I think y'all have probably heard 1 out of every 3 bites that we eat requires a pollinator. And they are really almost essential as everything else that makes our food grow. The sunshine, the soil, the water. So many plants, almost 90% of the world's plants need a pollinator for reproduction. These are not necessarily food plants, but they are plants that if they don't get pollination, they won't be making seed and therefore they won't be reproducing. We have had a bit of an alarming rate of decline in land-dwelling insects. It's right now declining at about 9%. We have had a little uptick in water-dwelling insects, so that's good news. But in one CNN report, they suggested that 40% of insects could be extinct in the next few decades. That's pretty quickly. And so when we're talking about gardeners, we can actually garden with such a good purpose because habitat loss is one of the huge reasons that we would be planting pollinator gardens to replace that habitat. If you just think about Asheville and the fact that so many of us see bears in our neighborhoods, well, that's because their habitat has evaporated. And you can imagine if the bear's habitat has evaporated, so has the pollinators' habitat. So all of those houses that we're building or those new lots that are certainly having a house pop up on it, that's taking away from existing habitat. The other big thing that we can control is our pesticide use. Pesticides, gardeners are actually a huge user of pesticides. I'm not sure of the figures, but it may even exceed the farm use. And a lot of times gardeners do not read the directions and use more pesticide than they should. So it's something we all want to be really careful about. Another thing that I think is so wonderful about this garden certification is that just by virtue of putting that sign in your yard, it allows a conversation to come up that allows you to talk about with your neighbors, talk about pollinators, and let them know what you're doing and let them know that they could just plant a little pollinator garden too. My neighbor next door is planting a pollinator garden right now, and so that's going to be 2 little habitats pretty close to each other, mine and then hers. So that's really exciting. And this is just a pretty picture for y'all to see. There is a pollinator garden in Pittsboro, and Debbie Reese is an extension agent there, and she has been doing pollinator gardening for years and years. So this garden is very extensive, very beautiful. If you follow her on Instagram, you will see a lot of dog pictures, but you'll also see some really beautiful pollinator pictures as well of this pollinator garden. And in the foreground here, you see echinacea, and then you see a lot of gorgeous bee balm in the background. Okay, so let's say we're setting out to fill out our application. I'm just going to give you a little overview of what you're going to be asked, because you don't exactly know until you get in there into the application itself what you're going to need to fill in. So of course, general information, your name and that kind of thing. And then you're going to want to list all the native trees and shrubs in your yard. And you're going to want to list all the native perennials in your yard. And you're going to want to assess how many larval hosts you have in your yard. And then there are a few other habitat requirements like water sources and types of shelter and protecting against invasives. What's your plan for doing that? How do you approach pesticide use? You'll need to articulate that in the application. And then there are a few questions about your garden itself. For instance, are you located urban, rural, suburban? How big is your garden? Is it acres? Is it 100 square feet? Is it on your balcony? And then you would just submit your application fee. And if you also want to get a sign, you can submit the fee for that as well. I would tell you this though, when I filled out the application for Reems Creek Nursery, and it was pretty extensive, it took me quite some time because we have a lot of plants here. I forgot to actually press the submit button. I went back to pay and I forgot to submit it. And so then I had to resubmit the whole thing, which took some time. So just pay attention to that. Just a little bit about pollination. So plants and animals have evolved together. So our native plants and our native pollinators have been in the United States, in Western North Carolina for a long time, evolving together, right? And so the particular plants we have in our region and the particular pollinators we have in our region have evolved together. And that is one of the reasons it's so important to plant native plants, because you're going to be sustaining the native pollinators, which a couple slides ago, I think it was, it turns out that there's possibly a 25% decline in native bees. So that is a really good reason to be planting native plants. Way back, when flowering plants started evolving, that was 100 million years ago. And at that point, everything was, there were no bees really, everything was wasps, and bees started evolving along with the flowering plants. And the main difference between a bee and a wasp, well, one of the differences is, in general, wasps have very smooth bodies and bees have hairy bodies. And those hairy bodies have the purpose of helping them to collect pollen. So the further the bees evolved away from the wasps, the hairier some of them got, if you think about how hairy a bumblebee is. And so when a bee is looking for food or a butterfly is looking for food, they're going to feed on nectar, and the bees are going to also feed on pollen. So those are the things that our plants are going to be providing. And this is just a little science slide to remind you what the parts of a flower are. So that part in the middle, the carpel with the stigma, style, and ovary, that's the female part of the plant in this lily. And the male parts are the anthers and the filaments. And if you look to the side, there's a squash plant, and squash is actually indigenous to North America, and there is actually a squash bee that has evolved along with that plant for pollination. But this is showing you that with squash plants, there's actually a male flower and a female flower. It's not all in the same flower. So native plants support native bees. Over 4,000 native species in North America. Isn't that incredible? And even though honeybees are not native, they also love native plants. You'll see them in your pollinator garden feeding on everything that you've planted. And that's a good thing too, because honeybees are also in decline. Plants for butterflies, you're going to need to do a little bit different approach for a butterfly, because not only does a butterfly need flower nectar, they also need to have a host plant. And the host plant is the plant they're going to lay their eggs on, so that when their eggs hatch, the baby caterpillar is on the kind of plant it likes to eat, okay? And when it comes down to monarch butterflies, which are really in the news, they particularly need a certain host plant, which would be the milkweeds, of which we have more than 3. I think it's around 5 native milkweeds in this area. But even if it's all of the caterpillars are going to be looking for a particular host plant. If you think about your vegetable garden, if you happen to grow broccoli or collards or kale, those are the host plants for that white cabbage butterfly. So if you think about it that way, we're not so happy to be the host plant for the cabbage butterfly, but that is really one of the few destructive, if you want to call it destructive, butterflies. So once those caterpillars have hatched out, they eat and eat and eat and eat. They go through a number of instars and get bigger and bigger and bigger until they're ready to turn into a chrysalis, which you can see this book is showing you the whole life cycle. There's the little egg and the caterpillar getting bigger, turning into a chrysalis, and then as they metamorphosize, they eventually emerge as a butterfly. Hummingbirds are another great pollinator, and they actually pollinate 160 North American plants. We think of tubular plants as plants that would be most attractive to hummingbirds, and if you think about the shape of their nectar sipping device, their long pointy bill is going to be how they're going to get to these plants. Although I have to say, in my own garden, they will also feed on zinnias, but many, many plants have evolved to accommodate hummingbirds, and the plants have evolved also to accommodate the different size of the bee's proboscis, which is its mouth part that's kind of like a straw that sucks up the nectar. And so some bees only have very short proboscis and others have really, really long proboscis. Same with butterflies. There are lots of other pollinators around too: flies, beetles, mammals, bats, even salamanders. Oftentimes flies are attracted to flowers that smell more like rotten meat. So maybe some examples would be some of the viburnum flowers. If you've ever smelled pear flowers, they don't smell very good either. And that's probably because they're attracting a fly pollinator. This is the sign I just discovered in my neighborhood, and I was so thrilled to find that one of my neighbors had gotten their garden certified. So we're jumping into how the certification is set up, and it's set up really to encourage all of us to jump in and get started. So the very bottom layer, the egg layer, only requires 6 plants for you to get started having a certified pollinator garden. So if you had 2 early blooming native perennials, 2 mid-season, and 2 late native perennials, and one of those perennials was a larval host, you are set to go. with the exception of having a water source, and that is as simple as a bird bath. Okay, and as you move up the tiers, there's a little bit more required. So the next tier, the caterpillar tier, you're talking about native trees and shrubs. So that requires 2 native trees and shrubs. And you'd be surprised what you might find around your yard in regard to native trees and shrubs that you might not even be thinking about, like a red maple tree, silver maple tree, sugar maple tree, tulip poplar, some of the oak trees. There are lots of trees around that we just like, and they're going to be dogwoods, that they're going to be in your garden. So the native dogwoods would be another common plant that you probably would have. Another addition to the second tier, the caterpillar, is one form of shelter. And we'll talk about the forms of shelter later, but that can be as simple as a little bare spot in your yard that would allow ground nesting bees to find a place to make their nest. And as the tiers move up, it has a little bit larger requirement for the number of trees and shrubs, the number of native perennials, each layer, and the number of larval hosts, and the forms of shelter. And you'll notice that all of them include removing invasive plants and avoiding pesticides. So if you go on the Asheville Greenworks website, and this is a direct link at the bottom of this slide to these plant lists, but you can just go to programs and then go to Bee City Asheville. And if you are actually in the Pollinator Garden Certification application, you will find links to all 3 of these lists, which are fantastic. They're specifically for Western North Carolina. And so there's a separate list for trees and shrubs, a separate list for perennials, and then a super helpful list that tells you when those perennials are blooming month to month, which is really helpful when you're trying to plan your garden. This is the way those pages look of the lists. And so you'll see that it starts off with the botanical name of the plant, and if you're not sure what that is, you can look at the common name of the plant. Then it tells you the approximate bloom time of the plant, how tall the plant is, what color the flower is, because you'll want to know that for planning purposes, just to make your garden attractive to you as well as attractive to different pollinators, because different pollinators are attracted to different color flowers. Then it goes on to tell you what sort of sun or shade it likes, whether it wants dry, moist, what kind of soil. And then it goes on to tell you what kind of pollinator will visit it. And the next column is it a larval host? And I was very surprised when I looked through this list to find out how many things are larval hosts. For instance, we probably know Asclepias is a larval host for the monarch butterfly, but here we've got goat's beard as a host, we've got wild columbine as a host, we've got pussy toes as a host. So there's a pretty extensive list of host plants in this list. And what is not showing, I couldn't fit it on the screen, are the plant nurseries. So the very next column over shows you which plant nurseries might have these plants, because some of them maybe everyone's going to have, and some of them only a few people might have, if you're looking for a particular native plant. And whether that's a tree or shrub in one list or the perennials in a different list. Here are a couple of other lists that can be helpful. If you go to these links, Xerces Society has a Mid-Atlantic region, and we're actually considered to be in that Mid-Atlantic region, but I also feel like the Southeast region does have some plants that are not on the Mid-Atlantic region. You just have to be careful because the Southeast is big and there's some that on that Southeast list that are not going to be hardy here. And this is another great list from the Pollinator Partnership that is just about our particular region. It says Central Appalachian. I sort of thought we were Southern Appalachian. And I'll mention one more list that I found. If you go to Carolina Native Nursery, they actually have a perennial list that is color coded. So you can just look at the list and say you were looking for a yellow flowering plant. You can look at that list and see all the yellow plants or all the pink plants or all the purple plants. So that's pretty useful. And there's some other links on the actual application to further lists. So my suggestion for you is to go outside in your yard. Before you start trying to apply, go outside in your yard with these lists. I had to make actual physical copies of them because I didn't want to be carrying a valuable computer around with me in my yard. So I made copies of all the lists, and that way I could make notes and either about things that I needed or things that I had, so that at the end of the day I would be able to compile my list easily. So things you need to know: you can include your whole yard. That was the question I asked because I've got things scattered everywhere and I definitely don't have it all in the same area. You can include all your flower beds. So you want to go and take an assessment of everything that you actually already have before you even get on the application form. And then you want to look around and list any water sources, which I have a bird bath. That's my water source. I have no trouble finding nesting and overwintering areas because my yard is not that tidy. So I've got dead wood laying around and bare spots and leaves and all kinds of things. And so, and then the invasive plants, you want to notice what you have, where you have, and where you have it, and what you're doing to try to get rid of it. Okay. All right. So count it up. How many do you have before you even get into that application? Because I actually started off thinking I was applying personally as a caterpillar level, which is the second level. But when I started adding it up, I thought, well, maybe I can get to the third level. And of course, I was feeling like I definitely wanted to if I could. So just tally everything up and then take your perennials and figure out what their bloom season is. So because you're going to need a particular number in the early season, the mid-season, and the late season. And tally that up so you know how many you have in each group. Tally up how many larval hosts you have, because I think the third layer, if I can remember, maybe needs 3 larval hosts. And so do you want to add more plants to reach the next tier? Well, I wanted to add more plants to mine because I did not have enough to get to the next tier that were in the proper bloom season. I had more in the middle, but I needed to add some plants at the beginning and the end. So a couple of things I went and got, for instance, were the native columbine and the native woodland phlox. And I planted them under a Japanese maple tree, so they'll have a little shade, which is where they kind of like it. And then I've added a lot of sunny plants I had to enlarge my area, which to accommodate some of these plants, which has really been exciting. Okay, so when you're thinking about jumping in with adding plants, you do want to think about through the seasons, and the time when the bees really need it is early and late. So if possible, if you can be a little generous on the early and late ends, that's going to really help the pollinators. The other thing you want to do, and this is not just, it does attract a diversity of pollinators, but it's also attractive to us. It looks pretty. if you think about the different heights, the different flower shapes, different flower colors, and also leaf texture, which isn't in that list, and differing scents. So if you think about flowers, some of them have a center that is really flat and kind of like a landing pad. A lot of pollinators really like that. Butterflies really like that. If you're thinking about a penstemon or the columbine, that's a much more tubular flower, and that's going to attract a different kind of pollinator. And your objective is to attract as many pollinators as you possibly can to your garden. And I think for me personally, I am doing good. I'm gardening for good by having my pollinator garden, but I have to tell you, it gives me a thrill every day seeing those pollinators. It lifts my spirits. So when you're planning additions, you need to think about how large will that plant be, and ideally you want a 3 to 4 foot clump. Well, if your plant is eventually going to be 3 feet, you may only need to plant one plant. But if your plant's only going to be 1 foot wide, then maybe you want to plant 3 to 5 plants so you have a really nice clump, and it's also going to be prettier. So the next suggestion I have is put your pollinator garden where you can enjoy it. If you're never going to see it, it's not going to be as much fun for you. I have mine kind of right out my front window, and this is sort of dorky, but a lot of times I am kneeling on my sofa just peeking out my front window curtains so I can see what's going on in the pollinator garden. It just gives me a thrill. I don't have a front porch, and I just have a chair sitting on my little sidewalk so that I can sit there and hang out and just watch the fluttering and the buzzing and the visiting of all these creatures. Last year, I definitely had a hummingbird just fly right up to my face and hover there looking at me for a few minutes. I was thrilled. And the other part that you want to think about, if possible, your sunny spots are going to attract more pollinators. But if all you have is shade, do not be discouraged. There's a huge list of wonderful shade plants that pollinators are attracted to, so that should not slow you down whatsoever. I repeated this slide just to kind of refresh your memory about all the different levels. Okay, each one has a little bit greater requirement. And at the very top, you're talking about 5 native trees and shrubs, 15 native perennials, 5 in each bloom time group, and 4 larval hosts, a water source, 3 forms of shelter. So that's at one end, and at the other end is basically 6 plants and a water source. So you can figure out where you want to land in that spectrum. This is an example of just the tier 1. So on the application itself, there are 4 different starter plant lists, 2 for the egg level and 2 for the caterpillar level. So I just wanted to show you what this would look like. So this is just an array of plants. Early plants would be the coreopsis, which is that yellow sort of daisy-like flower, and the yarrow, which is the pink flower that is kind of an umbral-shaped flower. And then next is the coneflower. Both the coneflower and the yarrow have a really long bloom time. And then you're getting to bee balm is the red flower, and I'm actually not sure if I put the proper bee balm in this picture. I realized later, but this is also a native bee balm, and that blooms June to September. That's a really long bloom time. The next plant is the swamp milkweed, and so that's serving as floral resources with its flower, but the monarch butterfly is also going to lay eggs on its leaves, and the caterpillars will eat those leaves. And then we've got goldenrod, which September to October, and even later, goldenrod is across the entire country. It is a great native plant for pollinators. And it is one that you may have to be a little bit careful about in your garden because it does like to spread. But in the fall, you can't beat goldenrod. This is one we pulled together just quickly. We had a question about what if I just want to have a couple of pots on my porch or my balcony. So we pulled these 6 plants together. That would be the egg level. And so you would just have to add a water source. And there you go. Maybe you've got 2 pots that you plant. The butterfly weed in the front middle is going to offer blooms, and again also be a host plant for the monarch. So I think if I were planting this, I would try to imagine which ones are going to get bigger and kind of mix it up with the smaller ones so that the pot itself is going to look pretty. And things like black-eyed Susans tend to spread, things like yarrow tend to spread. So pretty soon you would have a gorgeous plant going on. That short willow leaf sunflower, the normal willow leaf sunflower gets taller than me. And so that one is a short one. I think it is maybe only 2 or 3 feet tall. And this is an example of the caterpillar level. So that's 1 tier up. So basically the difference in the egg level and the caterpillar level is in this level, you are required to have 2 native trees and or shrubs. So in this example, the shrubs are Virginia sweet spire, also called Itea, and sweet pepper bush, also called clethra. And in my own garden, I do have 2 clethras. I love clethra. It is one of the most fragrant plants. Pollinators absolutely adore it. It usually blooms in the summertime, and it's a really pretty plant, I think. And the ones I have planted are either hummingbird or sugar tina. They're a smaller one, so they only get about 3 to 4 by 3 to 4 feet. There is a larger one called, I think it's called Ruby Spires. I might have the name wrong. It has pink blooms, but it's much larger, I think 6 to 8 feet. So you would need to have a little more room for something like that. So the early plants in this one are the lance leaf coreopsis, the yellow flower in the bottom left, and then creeping phlox. Believe it or not, creeping phlox, our beloved creeping phlox, is a native plant. Isn't that cool? And then in the mid-blooming range, we've got Baptisia or false indigo, and that's got beautiful pea-like flowers. And we've also got butterfly weed, and that's also your host plant. And then later blooming, which mine actually usually blooms earlier than July, but I'd say that's probably about on target because we have that in our pollinator garden, and it's sending up a flower stalk, but it's not blooming yet. And that is in the upper corner, the purple spiky plant, and they are just gorgeous, and they bloom a really long time. In the lower corner, we've got the New England aster, and asters are beloved by pollinators, and this is also a larval host, so wow, that's great. There's a lot of different asters. One that we have planted in our pollinator garden that I really love is called October Skies. I'm not sure if it's a New England aster, I can't remember. But when we first planted it, I thought it looked maybe a little weedy, but as it grew out during the summer and slowly became covered with these pale bluey lavender flowers, it's absolutely gorgeous, and it bloomed a long time. This is a picture of our pollinator garden. It looks different now. This picture was taken, I don't know, a few weeks ago, but on the right side of this picture, there's some red rocks penstemon that Joy was talking about earlier, and it is full bloom right now. It almost needs deadheading already. Rebecca or Black-Eyed Susan is in the front left corner. Behind it is some liatris. Behind that is some Echinacea purpurea. And in that pot is mountain mint, and there's coreopsis in a number of places. This garden is packed. You can't, behind that pot, between that pot and that shrub is where the October skies aster is. So this is not a huge garden, but a fairly nice sized garden, and it really, we could not believe how quickly and wonderfully it filled in. Now, we did start, like the Black-Eyed Susans, I think we probably planted 5 1-quart pots of Black-Eyed Susan. And this year I had to remove a bunch of Black-Eyed Susan. It actually went crazy. So, yeah. So, but I'm just encouraging you, that doesn't take that long to have these gardens turn into something that is so gorgeous and beautiful. Even by the end of the year, they're going to be filling out and looking awesome. So we're going to go on from the plants and talk about what are some other things you're going to need. Well, you're going to need a water source. This is in my garden. This is my water source. It's a bird bath, and I put some shallow rocks in it so that pollinators could kind of get on the top of the rocks and just sip the water. They don't want to have deep water. That is not what their thing is at all. So you want to provide shallow water. So if your bird bath is more of a deep bowl shape, you might want to fill quite a bit of it with rocks. If you have a water garden, that's a really nice source. I read this idea somewhere yesterday and I loved it. Hang up a dripping bottle. And because most things really love moving water. And I saw this picture on Facebook, I think it was, that it was a fountain that was just flowing over the edge. And the number of hummingbirds visiting that fountain was incredible. It was such a sight. You could also make a mud puddle, consciously make a mud puddle in your garden to accommodate butterflies. You know, when you're just driving around out in the country, you'll oftentimes see butterflies feeding in these mud puddles. They're taking up minerals, and a lot of times it is the male butterfly taking up minerals for mating. If you happen to have a pond, a creek, a stream, any of those things will work as a water source. Reems Creek Nursery does have a pond, and we had a bird bath, but someone bought it, so we need to install another one down there. We have lots of bird baths sitting around with water in them, but one that's sort of designated to the pollinator garden, we don't really have that right now because it evaporated. Forms of shelter. So look at this little cutie pie peeking up out of the ground. And when you see pictures of some of these nesting bees, there'll be like a little hole that goes down, and then little branches that go off, and then little rooms off these branches where each one of these bees has a little nest. And so bare unmulched earth is a really great resource in your garden for bees, bumblebees especially, and solitary bees. I had no trouble meeting that criteria. I've got, you know, bare stuff everywhere, but how hard is it to pull back a little bit of mulch and just, there you go, you've got some form of shelter. If you've got a dead tree snag or even just a few dead branches laying around somewhere, just throw them in the back of your garden and there you go, you've got that. Things like the pith of stems and twigs, something like elderberry has a real soft pith. That would be a place that pollinators may make a little nest. Bamboo pieces, sometimes people tie bamboo together, little strips of bamboo, and the little holes can be visited by pollinators. If you are doing something like that, the bee hotels aren't really part of this certification because there are some issues with diseases and different things like that, it has to be maintained properly. So that's a little complex to go into. So we're not counting bee hotels in these forms of shelter, but even a patch of native grass, and even waiting until spring to cut your garden back, to cut your perennials back, will provide habitat. Leaf litter, I had no problem with that one either. I think all of us probably have little crevices where there's leaf litter under bushes that we never raked up and things like that. Well, think about it. This year, purposely leave some of that leaf litter so that you're leaving a place, especially for the mated bumblebees to overwinter. And so the next criteria is protecting against invasive. First of all, we want to recognize who those invasives, who they are in our yard. Some people get mixed up with Japanese honeysuckle, thinking because it's everywhere that it's a native plant, but it's a very invasive honeysuckle. There are native honeysuckles, and we sell them at Reems Creek Nursery, but they are not the one that is everywhere taking over the world. That's an invasive. I have that in my yard, and I'm trying to keep it beat back. Oriental bittersweet is another one I have in my yard. I had never encountered that before. It is just a voracious vine that wants to take over the world. And so I'm trying to keep it cut back. It's in my neighbor's yard all over a tree, so I know that birds are probably going to feed on it and poop it out in my yard, but I'm doing what I can. English ivy, another one I have in my yard, and I'm just trying to keep it mowed back. That's about all I am able to do at this point. It's only in one section of my yard between me and my neighbor. And privet I also have in my yard. All across the back of my yard, coming up everywhere. But I did last year try to cut off a lot of the buried branches so that those seeds would not be eaten by birds and dropped everywhere. I got all the ones I could reach. I do not have multiflora rose, but I bet a lot of you do. That's another invasive. Miscanthus, or Chinese silvergrass, is the grass that you see growing all along the highway everywhere, and it is highly invasive. At least if you can cut the seed heads off, you're going to be helping people. Princess tree, or Paulownia, is that tree. You'll see it along the interstate. It kind of looks like a wisteria flower pointing the opposite way, but it's a tree. Japanese barberry is also an invasive because it can drop seeds. I do have one in my yard. I'm intending to dig up. It has not dropped seeds in my yard. I haven't found any babies, but nonetheless, it does show up in the woods. Autumn olive is another one. Japanese spirea is another one. And these are ones, this list came off of a brochure I'll show you later, but it's for Western North Carolina. So all of these are found in Western North Carolina. Next thing, avoiding pesticide use. To me, this is huge, 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 because this is something we can actually control in our own gardens. And if you think about an insecticide, the job of an insecticide is to kill insects. Well, most pollinators, not hummingbirds and bats and things like that, but most pollinators are insects. So whether that's a butterfly, a bee, a flower fly, any of those things, it's going to be harmful to them. But a pesticide includes not just insecticides, but also herbicides and fungicides, for instance. And I'm saying right here, Roundup, for instance, is a pesticide. And what they have found is that a lot of these things, when they were trying with colony collapse disorder, there's been a lot of research into what is causing that. Colony collapse disorder, if you don't know, is something that is in the honeybees, not the native bees, but in trying to figure it out, they have found that some of these different herbicides, fungicides, insecticides work synergistically to actually turn into a total that is worse than those things if they were all alone, okay? So, suggestions. Be ready to accept some damage. Don't freak out. It's like, it's okay if there's a few holes in a leaf somewhere. There may be an edge where it's not okay. For instance, in my vegetable garden, if all of my kale is gone because it was completely eaten up, that is probably too much damage. So do I want to do something? I might want to spray my plants with BT, but that BT is really targeted on that plant to that caterpillar that's on that plant. Now, BT will kill other caterpillars. If you're spraying it all over your yard, it can kill good caterpillars that you want to encourage. So you always want to be careful, even with organic pesticides, because almost everything is actually toxic to pollinators. So you want to try to use the softest method possible. You want to avoid broad spectrum insecticides. That means, to me, that's like a big gun. If you can target it to the actual insect that you're trying to get rid of, and not just put 7 dust all over it that is going to kill everything. You don't want to do that, okay? And also systemic pesticides. One big one that's been in the news are the family of neonicotinoids, especially imidacloprid, which is in a lot of different products. Those systemic insecticides get in every part of that plant. So that means if an insect is feeding on the leaves, a caterpillar, for instance, is feeding on the leaves, or a bee or a butterfly is visiting the plant for nectar or pollen, that nectar and pollen, those leaves are going to have that insecticide in it. And, you know, it's very likely that that is going to have a weakening overall effect on the colony, on that species in general. A few slides ago, we read that there's a 25% decline in bumblebees. That's a quarter of the bumblebees. One of my favorite things to do in my garden is just use my fingers to squish eggs that I see. I'll even squish bugs. So if you have a stomach for it, that particular thing will never reproduce if you can do that. The other thing is that you can just have a jar of soapy water around your garden and just put it in a plastic jar, just keep the lid on it, and whenever you find a pest, just pick it up and drop it in that soapy water, or knock it into the soapy water if you don't want to touch it. And because of the soap, the insect will not be able to get back out of the water. It doesn't work if it's just plain water, okay? So I did want to say one more thing about the neonics. There's a product that a lot of people use on their roses. It is that Bare 3-in-1. That is a neonicotinoid. So that is a systemic pesticide. Bees will definitely visit your roses. And so if you're trying to help the pollinators, you don't want to use a product like that. The other thing about pesticides, if you are going to apply them as late in the day as you possibly can, practically at dusk, hoping that pollinators will have gone home. Don't apply it to flowering plants that are flowering at that time, or at least at a minimum, avoid the flowers when you're applying the pesticide. It really helps if you have some kind of a wand, if you're going to do those kind of things, because you can target where that product is going to be. The other thing is, if you have a host plant that you know caterpillars are going to eat it up, maybe you don't want to put it front and center of your garden. Maybe you want to tuck it back somewhere so that damage isn't going to bother you. So managing your pollinator garden, let's say you've got everything planted, and these are just a few things to think about. So first of all, put your plant in a habitat it will like. Say it's a native plant. Well, my columbine that I just planted is naturally going to be growing in the woods. The same with the woodland phlox I just planted. It's naturally going to be growing in the woods. The dirt in my front yard is hard orange clay, like a brick. And so those two things are not really going to go together. You want to try to create the natural habitat for that plant. So when I first moved up here, I had a little patch of all these cool native plants like golden seal and trillium, and I didn't know anything. I didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't even amend my soil. It was just planted in straight clay near the maple roots of a nearby tree. And it did okay for a few years, but eventually all those plants died because they just weren't in a place that they would like. I dug up a maidenhair fern from the woods, my own woods. I wasn't digging it up out in someone else's woods. And when I planted part of it in my garden, and I put part of it in a pot, I wasn't sure where I was going to plant it yet. Well, the part in the pot did a lot better than the part in the ground. Why? Because that potting soil was much closer to emulating the kind of soil that plant was growing in the woods. So if you're going to plant woodsy type plants, think about amending your soil with compost so that you're getting a more light, airier soil, right? And I, even planting all of my plants, because I have brick hard clay, I amended my soil. I know there are a lot of people that just promote throwing native plants in the soil that is there, and go for it. If you want to, I think they're going to thrive better with a little more care. So deadheading your flowers is going to keep your garden looking prettier, but it's also going to prolong that bloom time so that you're going to have floral resources for a longer time for your pollinators. At some point late in the season, you're probably going to want that plant to go ahead and make seed, because a lot of other critters feed off of those seeds. Birds, for instance, like to eat echinacea seed. They like to eat black-eyed Susan seed. So you can let those things go. But the Red Rocks penstemon that we've talked about, I deadheaded that in this pollinator garden at Reems Creek Nursery 3 times last year, and we got 4 bloom times on that one plant. The last bloom time was a little half-hearted, but it still bloomed, which means it was blooming it's already been blooming 2 weeks, so it was blooming well into fall. Regular watering can be really important. There's a few plants that do tend to get powdery mildew that we love for pollinators. One is bee balm, and another is coreopsis. So if you let your plants go really bone dry, they're going to be more susceptible to powdery mildew. Just saying. The other thing is, please take the liberty, like I would tell you, everyone on our staff does this for sure. If we plant something and we don't like where it is, we just dig it up and move it to a different spot. Or let's just say, I have a Stokesia Stokes aster that I've moved. This is the 3rd time I've moved it, because the last 2 times so many things have grown up around it. It wasn't prospering. So this time I'm trying to give it a little more space so it'll be a happier plant. And I know when we were talking with Lisa Wagner a couple of weeks ago, she was talking about editing your garden. And I think that's really important, to be on the watch for things in your garden. There may be babies coming up that you're thrilled about. That's awesome. So you may want to edit it to where you save that baby or you move that baby somewhere. We did not cut our black-eyed season back in our pollinator garden until very early spring. And a lesson was learned from that, because black-eyed seasons came up all over our pollinator garden. It was totally taking over. It was going out of bounds. We had so much black-eyed Susan that a few of us took it home. It got planted in another spot at the nursery. Some of it probably ended up dying because there was so much extra black-eyed Susan. So I wanted it to get back in bounds so that other plants also have a chance. But if something's taken over, you can just share it with one of your friends. There are plants that we were delighted to see they did reseed. So we had a lot of tiny baby liatris that reseeded in our pollinator garden. And we also had, whenever echinacea reseeds, I'm just thrilled about that. So this last line in this slide that says deadhead certain plants, well, my lesson this year was definitely, I might leave those black-eyed Susans on a little into fall, but I think I'm probably going to cut them off way sooner than I did this year so that they're not making babies all over the garden. That is the adorable sign you'll get if you choose to, if you apply for a certification and your certification is approved and you want a sign. So the actual application fee for certifying your garden is $10, and the sign itself, if you want a sign, is $35, and it comes with a stake and screws, which is totally awesome because you don't have to figure out how to install it. You've got all the little parts you need right away. These are a couple of books that I just wanted to recommend. The one is by the Xerces Society, Attracting Native Pollinators. The other one's a book I've had a long time. And it's not specific to native plants, but it's really cool because it takes you through the life cycle of a lot of different butterflies. It shows you the egg stage, the caterpillar stage, the chrysalis stage, and the butterfly itself. And then it lists plants it likes. A lot of the plants it lists are not native, but you can look that up in the sheets that you printed off from the application form, the long list of different native plants to choose from. And it's not like you can't add other plants that may not be on that list that are native to our area. That'd be fantastic. This is showing a pamphlet that when you open it up, it's like a field guide to bees in Eastern North America, just for fun, if you wanted to try to start IDing who's out there in your yard. The pamphlet on the right is one we have at the nursery, but it's also online. If you go to our website, you can click on, if you go to our website, go to resources, and I can't remember exactly where, but that is online. You can easily access it, and that gives you kind of another plant list. And then just for citizen science fun, Bumblebee Watch is something you could do. I think they take pictures and send them and hopefully identify them. I haven't done it yet, but I would love to. I also wanted to talk about some upcoming events. So this entire month is Pollination Celebration. And we're at the nursery celebrating Pollination Celebration, yes. And we're also celebrating Perennial Plant Month. But on this listing are other things that Bee City USA Asheville, which is part of Asheville Greenworks. These are other wonderful events that are going on this month that you can partake in. One of them is a pollinator photo contest, and one of the prizes is a $250 shopping spree to Reems Creek Nursery. So we hope you'll jump in and do that. Wouldn't that be fun to win? And then there's a great movie that's going to be online on Tuesday, June 23rd. You would have to go to the Greenworks website to sign up. And that will be followed by a Q&A, but I believe the movie is also going to be available separate from that Q&A. And then there's going to be a talk by Timothy Spira, who's written a wonderful book about native plants. So interactions between plants and pollinators, that's going to be an online workshop. And then, and that's on the 26th, and on the 27th, which is a Saturday, Lisa Wagner, who some of you have already seen in 2 or 3 workshops at Reems Creek Nursery, is creating a pollinator-friendly garden Zoom workshop. We know that'll be fantastic because she does great workshops. So go to Greenworks website and click on Pollination Celebration, and you'll be able to sign up for these various events. And come visit us here at Reems Creek Nursery. And at the bottom of this slide, I don't know whether it's live for you, but you could click on that link and go directly to the application link. So we just want to thank everyone for coming, remind you that perennials are 10% off. And Joy, I think we're ready for questions, and I'm going to try to figure out how to stop the screen sharing, okay? Let's see.
Yeah, we've got lots of questions.
Oh, wow, okay.
All right, so we've had a couple of questions here about, does this apply to people living beyond like the formal borders of Asheville? Can people in the surrounding areas, can they also get certified?
Yes, they can.
Including as far out as Burnsville?
I think yes, they can.
All right.
If Phyllis is in this crowd and understands it differently, send us a chat. But as I understand it, yes, they can.
Cool. All right. We have another question here about how do we define native? Is it just plants in North Carolina, or is it a broader classification that is needed for the certification?
Well, that's a really good question. Everyone likes to interpret that a little differently. The ideal scenario would be that it is natives from within the Western North Carolina region, because those particular natives are going to be most supportive of the native pollinators that are in Western North Carolina. However, you know, there are a lot of different, I mean, I have natives in my own garden that are more broad than just Western North Carolina. So I would say it could be a broader selection, but ideally it is a selection of Western North Carolina plants, just because it's going to maximize the floral resources for pollinators.
Okay, we have another question here about, are we able to send out a copy of the PowerPoint to people?
You can't yet, but oh gosh, did you hit record?
Yes,
Joy?
I did.
Thank you. Okay, so we have recorded this PowerPoint, and we will make it available on our newsletter. Our newsletter comes out next Friday. Now, just in case there was a weird glitch this Friday, and I don't know what happened, the newsletter did not go out until 8 o'clock at night, but normally it comes out early in the morning on Friday. So there'll be a link there, and the entire PowerPoint will be available, yes.
Okay, we've got a question here about azaleas. Do any azaleas count, or only specifically native azaleas such as the flame azalea?
There are a lot of other natives besides the flame azalea, but if you are, only native azaleas are going to count for the purposes of this garden certification. Yes, but there are more than just the flame azalea. There are a number of them. I'm pretty sure on that plant list, there's a number of different azaleas listed.
Yeah, I remember we tried to bring in quite a few in the spring.
Yeah. A lot of times we have a really great native azalea selection.
Someone's asking if we have, or if anyone knows about lists of invasive plants, ideally with photos. Are there any resources that you know of?
Well, you could Google it on the internet. I don't know if you go to that pamphlet the one I was talking about that is specific to Western North Carolina, I don't think it's a live link to those invasives. I don't think so, but yeah, sorry, I didn't provide. I only put in the picture bittersweet and English ivy, which I'm pretty sure everyone knows what English ivy looks like
Right.
already.
There's someone here asking some questions. I'm trying to understand. It says here, name of the online source not listed in the PowerPoint. You mentioned it after you talked about Xerces and the pollinator partnership. That's from Eleanor Beal.
It may have been that I mentioned that I found a list on Carolina Native Nursery. Carolina Native Nursery is the sponsor of Pollination Celebration this year, but on there, I'll hold this up. You can see it's color coded. Can you see that? And so it has shade perennials, sun perennials, full sun perennials, but it has it color coded so that you can tell the color of the flowers, which I think is really cool because you're not going to want all the same color right next to each other in your garden. That's not going to look that great, right? So to me, that's a really helpful resource. And you would just go to their website, and I'm not exactly sure. You may have to look around a little bit. I think it was on their homepage.
Okay, we've got some questions here about whether vinca is considered invasive in this area, and also trumpet vine.
Vinca is considered an invasive, yes. Trumpet vine is a native plant, and it is on that native plant list. I would have to tell you, though, that if you're going to plant trumpet vine, plant it with caution because it readily spreads. I mean, we used to have a huge arbor of trumpet vine here, and it was absolutely beautiful. It had the trunks were like this. It was a very, very old plant, and it would become covered with flowers, and the birds, the hummingbirds, loved visiting it. But it also threw seeds everywhere, and it's still coming up. Even it was way over by our native plant section, and it comes up in our pollinator garden. That is so distant, and it's not even, we took it out. So yeah, I don't even know how it's coming up. So I would be very, I would pay attention if I were going to plant trumpet vine, and I would be ready to give it some very strong support. It's a large plant, and I might be tempted to try to cut the seed heads off before they could be flung across my landscape.
Yeah, I've seen it growing on like telephone poles in urban settings and looking absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's see, we've got a question here. How can you remove poison ivy without using an herbicide? I'm very allergic to it.
Okay. I'll tell you what I did recently, and this is like something it took me maybe 2 years to get the courage up, okay? So I totally suited up. I had these orange, like, heavy-duty gloves and long sleeves, long pants, not thin long pants, thicker long pants, socks, boots. I think I had a ball cap on, and I went out into this place where it had gone crazy in my yard, and I worked and worked to try to get rid of, at least make a dent in it. Was I successful? Okay, so when I came in, and I'm not making any promises because I have gotten poison ivy many times, and it is something I do not want to get. But I came inside, I actually went into my washing machine, stripped off my clothes, put them in the washing machine, washed them in hot water. I went and washed myself with Joy or Dawn dish soap, which has a detergent in it. So I washed my face, my hands, my arms, my neck, totally off with that, probably a couple of times. And then my friend had loaned me some Technu, and I did that as well. Okay.
Technique's awesome.
So knock on wood, I did not get it. Okay. But you do have to be extremely careful. It is not a friendly thing, especially if you're allergic to it. So, and I stayed out there for hours. I did not take a bathroom break. I did not eat my dinner because I didn't want to have to pull all of this gear off and get it all back on. So I was out there until dark.
Right, right. So we've got another question here. Is insect soap considered acceptable? This is when you were talking about all the pesticides and things that can hurt the bees.
Safer soap can hurt, yes. Safer soap is one, probably the softest method that you can use. Will it compromise pollinators? Yes. So if you're spraying safer soap, again, try to spray really, really late in the evening where it's not going to have direct contact with the pollinator.
All right. We also have a question here. What is a good phone app to ID plants?
A good what?
Phone app?
Oh, isn't it iNaturalist?
I know there's a couple out there.
Somebody help me out. iNaturalist? Is anything in the chat? Well, we may have to get back to you on that, but I think iNaturalist is one where you can post it and people respond with what it is.
All right, see here. We have more people asking about how to ID things. The Botanical Gardens website is good info on invasives. Oh, iNaturalist. Yes, people are helping us out in the comments. Thank you so much.
And I'd have to add to the Botanical Garden, not just their website, but going to the actual Botanical Garden itself is a fantastic and inspiring way to see plants. I know when I first visited it, I was like, I went home at the time I was living on 50 acres. Like, oh my God, I've got that plant right here. It was so exciting, you know. So I found coral bells out in the woods, and I found maidenhair fern out in the woods, and I found woodland phlox out in the woods, and black cohosh out in the woods. So cool.
Awesome. Well, it looks like that we've covered all the questions here in the chat.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for coming today. We're so happy to have you. We hope you see all, we get to see all your faces. Hey, Betsy. We hope to see all your faces at the nursery. We are still having shorter hours. Our hours are 10 to 6, Monday through Saturday. We're still closed on Sunday, and I don't think we'll be open on Sunday the rest of this year. So, but we appreciate you taking the time out of this beautiful Saturday morning to be with us. Thank you very much. Joy, shall we end the meeting?
Yeah, sounds good.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.